My name is Madeline Rose. I'm a global advocacy advisor with Mercy Corps, one of the co-hosts. And I'm really excited to tap into something that I'm personally passionate about and spend a lot of my time on, which is thinking, how do we pursue collective action in the peacebuilding movement? I think Richard set us up really well at the end of that last panel, right? Which is that we know how to plan, we know how to harness data, we're getting a lot better on the sort of governance and policymaking side of positive peace, but you need motivation, often of politicians and policymakers, in order to compel change. How do we motivate? How do we inspire motivation? Right, that's through movement building. So as we go into this panel, I encourage you to think about two questions. So while the speakers talk, I want you to think, just take a moment. It's been a long day, but just in your own head, think right now to how you would answer two questions. The first, does a coherent peace movement exist today? Yes or no? Question two, do you think we need a more coherent peace movement? So I hear a lot of yeses, which is obviously my assumption. But no, so that's what I want you to think about. What is the disconnect in the peace field? We've heard about activists and organizers and new policy and new research today in Mexico, in Colombia, in Guatemala, in the United States. There are a lot of people, there's a lot of intellectual energy and a lot of investment going into violence prevention and violence containment. But the field itself is not effectively achieving collective action and collective impact. So we're going to dig into why we think that is and talk a little bit how we tap into the networks that do exist for more improved collective action as a sector. So first up, we're going to have Bill Vendley, who's the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, which is a global affiliation and organization of interfaith leaders around the world. And I also just found out he's a dear friend of Landrum Bowling, who, if you haven't heard of Landrum Bowling in the peace field, he's a longtime organizer and activist of the Quaker tradition, who was also an original co-founder of Mercy Corps. So Bill, thank you for starting us off.
Okay, thank you very much. I must say I have learned a great deal today. I want to talk about religions, not specifically any one religion, but religions together beginning to collaborate. It's a real phenomena of our time. It's not, it doesn't make the headlines in the way the abuses of religion do. Give you two quick little episodes, one very, very local, one a little more global and happening right, a larger level, at least happening now. A couple of years ago in Kenya, a bus was attacked by a terrorist group, Al-Shabaab. And the terrorists entered the bus and asked the Muslims on the bus to identify the Christians so the Christians could then be pushed off the bus and then shot. Now, what actually happened was that the Muslims surreptitiously took off parts of their clothing that was identified as Islamic and shared it with the Christians. That was sensational enough that it made the New York Times. But that kind of activity actually goes on, and I've been party to it and seen it or been told it again and again and again, where people of one tradition are actually helping men and women of the other tradition. Another example that's unfolding now, and it's in Myanmar, that my own organization is involved with, is that next week, about 10 days, the government, Aung San Suu Kyi, representatives of the military, all stakeholders across Myanmar, backed by some 15 states, will gather to inaugurate publicly a 2-year peace and development process. Will it work? We don't know. Would it have been able to be mounted as we currently know it without the religious communities? I don't think so. And how would that work? It would be because the supreme patriarchs of Sri Lanka, of Cambodia, would go to Myanmar, use their credibility as Buddhists to make clear in that Buddhist majority state that it's Buddhist to to engage in dialogue and collaboration across religious lines. And so today, as the religious communities are figuring out how to be advocates and actors in peace, they're working locally, but they're recognizing their communities are global and that they can reach across their communities to reinforce the communities when they get stuck or when they're captured by all sorts of non-religious pressures. How are they doing it? Let me just give you a couple of little clues from someone who's worked at this for almost 3 decades. First of all, there's a kind of consensus in the multi-religious movement that religion itself is an asset. We all know it gets into big problems. So the slogan would be, don't leave your religious belief at the door. Come in as the person you genuinely are and try to figure out whether or not your own religious community or your religious belief could itself be an asset for building peace. Now, to do that, they've got to agree to do something that we witnessed in this country in the civil rights movement, in the person of Martin Luther King, and which America, I think, is actually rather good at, but I see this spreading all around the world. And that is that the religious communities are becoming bilingual. They're not leaving, the people, men and women in Myanmar, the Buddhists, are not stopping to be Buddhists, but they are learning how to speak a public language, a second language. Martin Luther would preach sermons in his own church, walk across the mall in Washington, and couldn't give the same sermon because out before him were all sorts of people who didn't subscribe to his particular religious heritage, but he was the same person, but speaking in a public idiom. So what's happening today is that the religions slowly, initially, but ever more rapidly, are becoming fluent bilingualists, keeping their own faith, re-inventorying their own religious heritage, but learning that they have to speak the language of care in multi-religious settings, indeed in multi-stakeholder settings. And I think this is a revolution that's just a tick too cerebral to get reported in our own presses, but in fact it's happening literally around the world. Now once this happens, the first sort of tendency, and this was noted earlier this morning, is for people to focus on negative peace. It's easier initially. There are real problems, and you learn strategically, or tactically rather, to choose the problems where you can get the greatest agreement. So the key is to get agreement. So in all sorts of very onerous and difficult situations, the religious communities figure out the area that they can gain moral consensus on, the deeply held, widely shared care that they can agree on, and then become operational and collaborate. But that begins to create a very remarkable virtuous cycle in which fear, suspicion begins to melt, areas of painful disagreement are more easily entered into conversation about, wider areas of agreement are built, and the little virtuous circle moves forward. As they do that, they are invited, as they inventory and study what the drivers or challenges are, or the drivers of positive peace, what are their assets? What would they bring to the table? And here there's a kind of immense and interesting creativity that takes place. None of the world's religious communities were originally built for the kinds of problems that we heard the last panel discuss, Sustainable Development Goals. So today we're all students of what are the challenges, what are the drivers, whether they're the drivers of threats to peace or the drivers of positive peace. But once we understand those drivers, we have a new lens, if you will. And the religious communities then use that lens to go back and re-inventory their respective tradition. What are the spiritual assets useful for that particular challenge? Threat to peace or advancing positive peace? What are the moral assets? And it's an asset only if it's an asset for, if it's actually something that would be helpful for me to engage. What are the social assets, the panoply of religious infrastructures? Going down to the end of the small path, how would we understand that as a potential asset, and then how would we engage that or mobilize and equip that? And that's where many of the experts that were speaking to us throughout the day become key assets to the religious communities to help them unleash their own potentials for action. I add to the assets the remarkable thing taking place, which is, what more do you get if you cooperate? What more happens if you, how would Quakers and Methodists and Lutherans and Catholics and Sunnis and Shias and other religions and their various groups, what more if they're all working together? What's the complementarity? What's the efficiency? How do they, in speaking a public language, set themselves up for multi-stakeholder partnerships? How clearly is this collaborative work a check, a break for misunderstanding and conflict? So that's afoot. It's afoot in 90 countries in the organization that I serve, but other organizations are here. United Religious Initiative. And so we can see this phenomena basically spreading around the world. How's my time? Go quick? Okay, I'll conclude. Next year, some 800, 900 religious representatives will gather, hosted by the German government, in what will happen to be a World Assembly of the organization I serve. They're going to be dealing with positive peace. And Steve is going to be leading, not only speaking on that topic, but leading the Commission on Positive Peace. So the work we're discussing here is making its way brilliantly into the religious communities. And so I think we're going to see an extraordinary catalytic interaction between the work that you've committed yourself to and the world's religious communities. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure listening to all the other contributors today. I want to start off here. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times had a tiny little thing in the magazine. It was a reader survey. And they asked readers, will we ever attain peace on earth? And 61% said no. 33% said maybe. And 6% said yes. And I feel that that's a huge problem. I mean, you could have arguments with the survey or with the, the question or whatever, but it's an indicator of real total lack of awareness of the efficacy of peace building. And making peace visible, I think, is critical, because how can we expect the public to advocate for peace if they never see it? Part of the problem is that they never see it on television. And so why does that happen? Well, there are a lot of reasons, and I'm going to get into some of them in more detail later. But basically, they have to do with biases on the part of media that focuses on violence, the fact that many editors don't actually see peace as a real story. There's a whole host. I mean, there's some problems with peace building in and of itself that make things difficult. But why is it important? Why does it matter if we don't see peace in the news or on television? Well, peace needs a lot of attention. It needs support. Basically, given the fact that there's way too much war in the world, we need to certainly learn more about how peace is made, which a lot of what we focused on today is exactly that. You know, peace needs nurturance and encouragement. It needs resources. It needs to find, and we need to train people to find peaceful solutions. And they need to learn how to do it. Right now, we're in a negative cycle. You know, peace building is rarely reported on any platform. As a result, it isn't seen as a solution to conflict. It's minimally resourced and supported, which the scarce resource inhibit its ability to, the practice's ability to achieve results, and therefore it stays under the radar because it's not actually accomplishing a lot. It could accomplish so much more if it had the kind of support and encouragement that it really needs. God knows we support military solutions to conflict a bit too much. How can we make that a positive cycle? Well, I look at it from a meta level in terms of communications. I think it's imperative that we focus more attention on peace building, so that you see it in the newspapers and on television more often. As a result, it would gain more visibility as a solution to conflict. People could see that peace building is efficacious, and there would be more professional training and resources could increase, and with increased resources, there'd be more peaceful outcomes to report on. And then we have a virtuous cycle. And so we did something, in order to attack the problem directly, we created a one-day symposium in Manhattan, right in the New York Times Center, as I like to say, in the belly of the beast. And it was a one-day symposium called War Stories, Peace Stories, and it looked at peace, conflict, and the media. And it was extremely well attended. We had 400 people there, and the atmosphere was electric. I mean, fortunately, we achieved 50% of the audience was journalists, which was a goal, and we achieved that. And so it was just a really great, I'm going to just skip through things and not tell you about every single thing, but we brought peace builders from all over the world to talk about their work. One of the things that we did was this is a symposium that actually had some tangible results. We partnered with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and they give grants to journalists. And we conducted a competition for journalists called Pitching for Peace. And they were amazed by the, thank you very much. They're amazed by the response. They received 200 applications from journalists in 60 countries, all of them interested in reporting on peace stories that they knew of. And they were going to choose 3 winners. These were 2 of the contestants from Colombia. They were going to choose 3 winners. They ultimately chose 10. And they funded, they spent about $120,000 to send these journalists off to cover those stories. So they looked at all these aspects of journalism and peace, and how we cover peace and conflict, and how can we change so that it works better, that people get a more balanced view of what's possible. So, but there are characteristics that peace building has that keep it below the radar. It's slow. It's quiet. It's personal. It's labor intensive. It's complex. And it's never finished. Those are not great things from the standpoint of covering peace. And has some other things. The results are hard to see. How do you quantify something that is not happening? You know, that is the absence of violence. The nature of peace builders themselves. One of the things that make a peace builder good at what they do is their ability to get their ego out of the process. I have to keep pressing this button like this. It's their ability to get their ego out of the process. Well, that very same skill that makes them good at peace building makes them very poor at promoting their stories. And so that we'll have to encourage some changes there. And it doesn't always work. But you have to understand that neither does violence always work. As a matter of fact, in peace building, no one's killed, nothing's destroyed, the process doesn't create refugees, education, healthcare, and the economy continue to function. Those are some pretty compelling advantages, I think. And yet, so why don't we make more peace and less war? Well, this is where we get to people's perceptions and also how we use resources. In the United States, we're spending this year $700 billion on war and the whole military budget. I'm really blown away by the fact that Americans are so passive in the face of these massive budget expenditures when you consider that these expenditures are consuming everything, all the resources that people need for the things that matter to human beings, like education, healthcare, infrastructure, economic development. All of the things that matter to human beings are being consumed largely by the military budget, and then they tell us we don't have money for these things. But we do have $700 billion to create war. Basically, the world spends close to $1.4 trillion annually. That's the entire world on military solutions to conflict. And the United States is half of that number, and it's huge. Well, you need to do a lot of marketing to get people to, so I'm going to show you a 90-second mashup of TV spots.
The threat is undiminished, relentless. The battle space is unpredictable, ever-changing. In our world, knowledge is power, timing is critical, and accuracy is essential. At Northrop Grumman, we've always been on the forefront of innovation. That innovation, pride, commitment is part of us. Raytheon collaborates to design, develop, and deploy innovative and affordable layered defense solutions based upon the mission and threat environment. Today's evolving threats demand a layered defense. Threats are always evolving. Threats, we face them head on. We, all of us, are building the world's most advanced stealth multi-role fighter.
Well, you can see those TV spots every Sunday morning on Meet the Press and Face the Nation. And, when you think about it, they're not selling a product. Nobody's going to go out and buy a B-35 bomber. No viewer is going to have that in his garage or anything. What they're selling is policy. They're selling and promoting lethal weapons as the best way to solve conflict. And yet these spots are ubiquitous. We see them. So it's bad enough that we see lots of war and violence on the news and in newspapers. It's even worse that they're allowed to promote their solutions. I mean, have you ever seen an ad for diplomacy? So I'm going to leave it there. I think my time is up, so I'll just leave it there. Okay.
Thanks, Jamil. I will say one idea that has been percolating in the peace-building advocacy community in Washington, D.C. Is to author a congressional, we can author it, but to introduce a congressional resolution that would include diplomats and humanitarians on Veterans Day. Right? So think about the millions and millions of dollars that go into these partnerships on Veterans Day. What if we started to change the behavior and the thinking of the American public to consider the service of a diplomat as a part of veteran service, right? So there's a lot of things percolating. What we as a community have to do is how do we start harnessing collective impact for these types of ideas, right? Our next speaker is going to be Summer Lewis, to my left. So she is the coordinator of the Rotary IEP Partnership and is leading a bunch of workshops and trainings around the world focused on how to motivate and organize and help youth organizers harness the positive peace framework for their youth organizing. Summer?
All right, thank you so much. I know we're really, really close to the end of the day, so I appreciate all of you who have stuck this out. But this is the fun panel, right? We're talking about grassroots movements. See? Yes. All right, so thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to fellow panelists here. I have the wonderful job of trying to harness the energy and enthusiasm of 1.2 million Rotarians around the world to get them to organize and collectively work together towards action, towards peace. Not really, my boss actually does that, but I have the pleasure of being the Rotary IEP Partnership Coordinator. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Rotary, I know we have some Rotarians here, thank you so much for coming. It's the largest international service organization in the world, 1.2 million Rotarians in the world, organized in 35,000 plus clubs in countries all over the place. Rotary's mission generally is to promote peace and goodwill. And Rotary works within 6 areas of focus, which I won't go into all the details, but one of those areas of focus is peace and conflict resolution. And more generally, these areas of focus relate to the Sustainable Development Goals, and they also overlap very, very well with the pillars of positive peace. So, in order to harness this energy of Rotarians and the grassroots community work that Rotarians do worldwide, Rotary decided to enter a partnership with IEP because it found that the positive peace framework and the pillars of positive peace provided an incredible tool for Rotarians to think about peace as a concept, but then also to think about it as an action. And so I have the joy of working in this particular area. As part of this partnership, there are tools being developed for Rotarians. These include an online learning platform, also developing curriculums for workshops, and additionally carrying out positive peace workshops. And I'm going to share a little bit today about one of these specific workshops that was held in Mexico in 2017. So why Mexico, just to begin? Well, Rotary has over 10,000 Rotarians in Mexico and 600 plus clubs, and IEP has a Mexico City office and also produces a Mexico Peace Index. So when the partnership was thinking about a strategic place to do a positive peace workshop, Mexico was clearly a winner. Additionally, Mexico doesn't rank so great on the Global Peace Index, but it ranks really, really well on the Positive Peace Index. So there's great potential for peace. So all these factors came together, and Rotary and IEP, together in May of 2017, held a workshop in Puebla, Mexico, for 304 young leaders from 21 Mexican states. And these participants were Rotaractors, which is basically someone under 30 who has not yet joined Rotary, incredibly motivated and active young people, but also university students and civil society leaders. The workshop took place over 2 days and included plenary sessions, panels, information shared like this in this conference, but additionally in-depth breakout sessions on each of the pillars of positive peace. So the objectives of the workshop broadly were basically for participants to gain knowledge, tools, and skills. We wanted them to learn something about positive peace. But then additionally, we wanted them to apply that learning, so to go out into their communities, to create projects, to create initiatives, and to share this information. And then finally, we really wanted to create and strengthen collaboration networks among these young people. So in addition to my role as Rotary IEP Partnership Coordinator, I also work with a nonprofit that does monitoring and evaluation, and we were brought on board to do the impact evaluation for this workshop, which is just a fancy way of saying basically to figure out if it had an impact and if it was positive, and if so, what was that? I won't go into extreme depth here tonight because again, we are at the end of the day. If anyone wants the detailed data, I'm happy to share that with you. But overall, we found that those 3 objectives that I mentioned, the workshop achieved those quite well. Participants did learn about positive peace and peace building. Many participants had never heard of that concept before, and because of the workshop, they had much better understanding of that. That seems pretty obvious, right? You go to an event, you learn something. But what we also found was that participants overwhelmingly did apply their learning, so they did reach that second objective, that they went back into their communities and they either strengthened a current project or they started a new one. As of our final survey, we found that 77% of those respondents had gone back home and started a project or joined an existing project. 100% of those participants who did that were inspired by the workshop to do that. We also found that those participants really went out and shared this information with other people. We extrapolated the multiplier effect, or what we would call the reach of the workshop information, to about 16,500 people. And that's still a conservative estimate because that's just based on people who responded to the final survey. But the exciting part of this is basically that information didn't just stay with participants. They actually went out and shared it in their communities, in their work, in their families, etc. And then finally, of course, we found that these participants created collaboration networks. They connected with each other. And almost a year after the workshop, they were still continuing to connect with these other participants. So this is all very exciting because we saw the impact of this workshop at a kind of broad general level. But since I have a little bit of time here, I also wanted to share just really quickly some of the impact stories that we collected from this particular workshop, just to kind of demonstrate, well, what exactly did these youth leaders do? One, for example, Brian from Puebla, but who also lives in Acapulco, Guerrero, he went back to his university and started a debate club because he was really focused on good governance. So he was really looking at the 3 pillars related to government, low levels of corruption, and free flow of information. And he wanted to encourage public debates about that. What's interesting to note is these 3 pillars are underperforming pillars in Mexico, according to the Positive Peace Index. So there's one example of someone addressing that. Additionally, Alfredo went back to his hometown of Uruapan, Michoacan, and said, you know what? Nobody talks about the issues we're dealing with. Everyone is scared because there's very high levels of violence in this state and in our town. So what I want to do is start a radio show, and we're going to talk about these issues. And his radio show reaches about 10,000 people. And finally, Yesenia from Ciudad Juarez decided to work with her Rotaractor Club to revitalize public spaces with peace murals, which I always like to say, people say, oh, that's nice, you're doing art. Well, what's really great about her project is that as they started to revitalize these spaces, they cleaned them up, they painted, they started noticing that people started occupying those spaces again. Families started coming out. And this relates to the last panel about design, correct? And ultimately, they started to see real shifts in the community. And at this point, they get calls from people now who are like, can you come out and paint a mural and revitalize this public park because we want to create this safe space in our community for people to enjoy again. So these are just some of the examples. We've also seen that participants have replicated the workshop. Dr. Mead was involved in one of them in Sinaloa, and there's at least 3 other examples of participants going out and creating not identical, but versions of this workshop. And what's exciting about this is that based on all of this, we're looking at expanding these positive peace workshops in 2019 in Mexico again, and also in Colombia. And from these workshops, we're looking at creating a curriculum, and this is in partnership with Partners Global, with Luis, who's here. So being able to take all of the information and all of the activities and all of the work that goes into designing these workshops, document that, create a curriculum that can then be shared with Rotarians worldwide to go out and replicate these workshops in their own community. So this, of course, is very, very exciting. Based on what I would say, this is just one example of a specific activity as part of the partnership, but it's exciting because, at least the way that I see it, this sort of partnership itself relates to what we talked about earlier with the SDGs and partnering for change, but it also relates to IEP's theory of change quite well, which really focuses on initiatives that focus on all 8 pillars, that improve aspects of positive peace, many aspects all at once, and that are locally owned and employ local solutions. So I'm really excited to be here to at least share this one initiative that's happening that seeks to harness the power and the energy of networks and to provide tools and skills to make systemic change. Thanks.
I wanted to kind of go over what Rotary and Rotarians are, but then also how that ties together with what we've done over the last 113 years that ties in directly with positive peace. And we've kind of built this up. So when Rotary started, it was started by a lawyer in Chicago. There's one lawyer in here. So their first project was to build a restroom up on the street up in Chicago. But we brought in different people from different career paths, different vocations. So as a doctor, lawyer, merchant chief, rich man, I don't think we brought any poor men in, but everybody from every sector of society became part of Rotary, and that's still the way it is today. And I think that's our uniqueness, and it's a power that we have to be able to connect and get about anything accomplished that we want to get accomplished, whether it's in education, whether it's in government, whatever it happens to be. We're in that sector of society, and we're connected to all of those as Rotarians. And actually, Summer over here took most of my things, so I've got to come up with some more ideas here. But it was we're built on avenues of service and areas of focus. Avenues of service and youth service. So we talk about youth and how that ties in. Of course, that ties in with positive peace, right? So it's youth development, whether it's career building in the schools, scholarship programs, whether it's, we have something called RILA, Rotary Youth Leadership Awards for high school juniors, almost in every district around the world. There's almost 540 districts. So we send thousands and thousands of kids to leadership camp around the world. In fact, in our district, we send 600 a year to a 3-day, 2-night camp. That's life-changing for them. And then in our school systems, we also have our Interact clubs, which are service organizations for our high school students. And so that's another connection with our youth in those areas. And then we connect to the next level up, and that's in the college level that Summer mentioned here, Rotaract. So we're able to connect all the way through the college years up until to tie in with Rotary. And we also have vocational service. So that's using our talents to help out in our communities. And we have international service. So we work, because we're in over 160 countries and territories around the world, we're in just about every place in the world. So we can develop those friendships and acquaintances to be able to do projects internationally. So we help accomplish things in another country. It might be getting an ambulance, a place that doesn't have one. Maybe it's bringing in a mammography machine. Maybe it's different things that we work on to connect internationally. And then also we tie in with community development. So we have our own communities that we represent. So across the United States, for instance, every little town you go into has got a Rotary wheel, right? And so they are the go-to group in that community to handle everything from the food banks to senior citizens help at the school systems. They are the people to go to get things done in that community, and they really are the leaders in that community. And then we, on this other side here, is our Rotary Foundation, which is the top-rated Rotary Foundation. Just got charity rating, navigator rating again, highest level foundation, because the money's well managed. We have good projects that are sustainable, and they're covered in 6 areas of focus. And one of those areas is water and sanitation. Does that tie in with the positive pillars of peace? Sure it does. We just talked about resources and sharing those resources. And one of those areas just got mentioned at our international convention up in Toronto, was that we've just signed a 12-year agreement for Haiti, that in 12 years we'll have water and sanitation for every citizen in Haiti. And it's a long-term project, because you have to, certainly there's been corruption, there's problems down there, but there's a variety of things that are happening there that we can get our arms around and systematically step through that process to make sure that we've helped citizens in another country. Then we have maternal and children's health. So we deal with a variety of issues. And again, in Haiti, we send teams down there to train other doctors and nurses to do pap smears, cervical cancer surgeries, a variety of things down there, and we do it around the country. We do cleft palate surgeries down in Mexico. About every month we send a team down there, and other districts do from Southern California here as well. And so we're doing those kind of efforts on that side. And then it's disease prevention and treatment. And so we work on a variety of things, but we've been working since about 1985, eradicating polio around the world. We're down to 3 countries left. And there were thousands and thousands of cases to begin with, and now we've got that down. It was 25 so far this year. And we have to be 3 years free from any cases, and we'll be endemic free. And it'll only be the second time in history that a disease has been eliminated or eradicated off the planet. The other one was smallpox, and we're this close to getting it done. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation works with us. We have the World Health Organization, Center for Disease Control, and we continue to work in those areas. And if we had peace in those countries, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, we would already had this thing licked. But we are that close to finishing the job, and we will finish that job. But we work on other diseases, including malaria, and I'm sure we're involved in some other areas in there. Then we do literacy and education, because we know if we don't educate people, how are we going to create peace if we can't communicate, right? And one of the top things we do is make sure the girl child gets an education. And to do that, we tie in with the water and sanitation side, because they need water and they need bathrooms, right? So we need the girls to be able to go to school. If a girl child gets educated, when she grows up and has her family, she'll make sure her children are educated. So it's extremely important on that piece. And that ties in again with the positive pillars for peace. So a direct tie. And then we get economic and community development. It was mentioned here that we do micro lending and kickstart businesses, and we do that in a variety of countries around the world. And we've done it right here in Detroit. Micro lending and kickstarted businesses down there is Launch Detroit. It got copied and was Launch Atlanta and Launch Raleigh, and it's moving around the other cities here in the United States as well as around the world. And then we get into the number 6, which ties into all of them, and that's peace and conflict prevention and resolution. We have 6 peace centers that are fully funded around the world. 5 of those are for master's program. We have 2 of our graduates here today, Summer and Reem. And we have 1,200 graduates. One is a 3-month certificate, the other are full ride for a master's program. And we have 1,200 graduates now out there. We send 100 students a year, fully funded. And we're about to take on, in the next 5 years, another 4 centers. One will be down probably in Central America, one in the Middle East, there's one in Africa, and one over in Southeast Asia. And so we're working on expanding that program. But that's not just what peace is. And our role, and Steve's been involved with this, and other folks here, is to help our Rotarians understand what peace is, and that each of us, those 1.2 million, are peace builders. Because when we can connect, when we can see each other and talk, and we work together and break down those barriers between countries, it's a global understanding and goodwill. And that creates peace in the world. And it's really powerful what Rotary is able to do in those connections out there. At the peace conference we put on in Ontario, California in 2016, we brought together folks from all over the world in there, but we also wanted to show people what peace was. That included human trafficking, child abuse, domestic violence, PTSD, because our kids are suffering that inner city. We hear gunshots all night long. Or see a chalk mark when they walk out to the bus stop the next morning where somebody was killed in front of their home. They're suffering the same way as our soldiers are and other military people are around the world from that. We had 104 different breakout sessions, 13 training tracks on conflict, what it looks like for conflict in personal life, homeschool, business, community, international trade, film, TV, media, major religions. And we had solutions there, not just talking heads, that provided solutions we could get behind and leverage those things. And we had some great success from that, especially on the human trafficking side. Right up here in Ukiah in Northern California, and they came in and they shut down an operation there where girls were being kidnapped into the sex trade right off the streets in high school. And we're having another one in 2020. And Steve was a keynote in 2016. He'll be back joining us here. IEP will be a significant part of that conference. And again, we know solution providers. We don't have all the answers. But with folks like IEP, with Mediators Beyond Borders, Peace Corps, those those groups that we partner with make a huge difference for us, and we can leverage those contacts, build on those solutions, and make a huge difference. And certainly mentioned the conference, the Positive Peace workshops that were put on. Those were funded through our Rotary Foundation. That was a global grant that helped pay for that. We also have online, was developed with IEP at Rotary, was our Rotary Peace Academy. So our Rotarians can go online and do online training with training modules in positive peace, positive pillars of peace, and understanding what that is. So I thank Steve for those great efforts, and I think I'm sure I'm out of time, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and all the work that everybody's doing here. And if you're not in Rotary, go to RotaryEClubOfWorldPeace.org and join us one Tuesday night. So.
When we think about collective action, every one of these speakers talked about both numbers and key components of society, right? So 800 to 900 of the world's largest religious leaders are coming together next summer in Germany. 1.2 million Rotarians who are now being systemically trained on peace. Over 400, high-level, at least 200 high-level journalists that came together in New York, right? So we know that we have volume, and we have volume of numbers. But when we think about harnessing that for collective action, the thing that I really picked on in this panel was that New York Times percentage, right? That 16% of people, 6% of people polled in this survey believed that peace was possible. So if I were an organizer of these organizations, right, I would say, how would we work together on an intentional strategy to increase that number in the next 5 years? How do we harness the members that we have, the 1.2 million plus people in our just small group, but this 4 people that represent, and work on an intentional strategy to increase the percentage of people that believe peace is possible? That's one example of what collective action in our sector could look like. So we have 10 minutes left for questions from the floor, and then we'll close.
It's not a question, it's just I would like to add that one of Rotary's efforts is the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, which is a collective of Rotarians who are trying to leverage the network as well to have this intentional focus on peace. And I just want to also highlight how important the history of Rotary is in relation to peace in the world that we see today. Paul Harris is one of my heroes. He went around after World War II, and he talked to Rotary clubs when the United Nations was only an idea. It wasn't even there on the ground. And he said, if we give the United Nations half a chance, it will succeed. This is what Paul Harris said. And now Rotarians signed the Declaration of Human Rights, and Rotarians wrote the outline for the UNESCO organization. So those entities that are very important to positive peace and really derive the development goals were part of a vision of Rotarians long time ago when they were not reality. And in the same sense, the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, which is an effort by Rotarians, and for the world, is building a strategy called the Peace Builder Clubs, where we bring the intentional focus at the club level for peace to activate Rotarians to create those platforms to convene their communities. So just wanted to enrich what Summer and Rudy, which I work closely with both, about Rotary's role in peace.
I had a question about money actually involved in war. So Jamil mentioned that $1.4 trillion is spent on war. That means that some powerful individuals actually have a lot of interest in keeping war a reality, and it's a very lucrative enterprise, which probably means that peace is difficult to build. Do you have any thoughts about how to counter that or make it less lucrative?
I'll speak to that a little bit. I mean, as I said when I spoke, it's amazing to me that we allow the Department of Defense to get away with, and people are so passive in the face of these massive expenditures that consume so many things, that the resources that we need to do the things that matter to people. I think, in a sense, one problem is that people don't see peace building as a solution, and so they don't advocate for it. And that's really one of the things that I'm so anxious to try and change, and that is to get more newspapers and more news organizations to cover peace. And it's a challenge. But once we got some journalists there to see how compelling these stories are, and that began to talk about seeing peace builders as heroes, seeing spreading the idea that you don't have to carry a gun to be a hero. That's part of it, because if we don't see an alternative, then it's natural to default to violence and default to war as a solution to conflict. But, in that video, when they say, we face threats head on, and you notice all of those narrators have these heavy testosterone voices, the threats aren't at 30,000 feet, and the solution is not to bomb. Bombing is, the United States dropped 27,000 bombs in 2016. Do you feel safer? I'm not sure I do, that's for sure. And, I don't think that's making us safer, but we have to really work together to demand that we look much harder at how we spend our funding, and that we spend more on peace building.
Rudy?
I think another answer to that is an education side. And certainly Steve's got the numbers to show on how peace is good for business. So we have a business model for war, but we also have a business model for peace. And we need to be more proactive about that. We also need to be able to not be afraid to step up to our elected officials and say, hey, we need to fund this, not this. And that should be our role here as citizens. Obviously today, we all voted, or we voted before we got here. But that's part of our voice out there, is that education process, which also includes nuclear arms. We're investing a whole lot to create these new ways to annihilate ourselves. And we can say to our people that would fund that in Congress and say, that's not acceptable. And you better not vote for it. Right? So that's our voice that has this. But it's an education thing. It's certainly an economic thing. If you need those numbers to spread those out, reach out to Steve's group, IEP, and you'll get those numbers. And please talk about those and the positive effects, the good that peace can do to our economy is super. It's great.
I just had one quick thing to add to that, and this may sound extremely simplistic or just kind of an overarching solution, but focusing on youth and youth education and youth training. These workshops, for example, are 18 to 30 years old, but you can go even younger than that. Again, that may be simplistic, but if you can start impacting how young people think about peace, what possibilities there are, and especially within the framework, I think, again, there's more than 6% that are going to believe peace is possible, and so perhaps focusing on that is one way to at least try to make change.
And just the last thing to add, if a couple of real-time advocacy opportunities, if you're really interested right now on U.S. military funding, engage on the Yemen advocacy campaign. It's the first time in my decade of working in advocacy in Washington that we've actually had over 100 members of Congress willing to withhold funding for arms sales because of a war. So sign any petitions you see on the war in Yemen. The Pentagon Budget Campaign and the Friends Committee on National Legislation are two organizations I would send you to who have done sustained, over 2 decades of military budget advocacy in Washington.
So I'm an international lawyer, and law has been largely absent from what we've been discussing at the conference, so I'll just provide a little bit of information for you. Rotary and this conference are not political, but something is taking place right now that needs to be given some attention, serious attention to, and that is we have treaties that are being abrogated unilaterally by the president. And these are treaties that have been confirmed by the Senate of the United States. It is an abdication of the function of the Senate to allow these treaties to be abrogated without any discussion. We've been going to war without any discussion in our Congress, and our treaties that have been carefully crafted and negotiated are being abandoned without any discussion in our Congress. Now, it's one thing not to be political, but it's something else to give up representative government. Our representatives are not doing their jobs. So demand that this be reviewed. Treaties are not to be abrogated independently by the executive. And as far as going to wars, there has been a list of countries that have been announced for a very long time, going all the way back to the George W. Bush administration. 6 countries were targeted, and we've been pursuing that objective, and Iran is on the list. So it's a very serious matter that this is going on without any debate in Congress. Treaties are going by the boards, new wars are starting, and our Congress stands mute.
Philip Helmick, I work with the Shift Network. We do a lot of online education looking at peace from the interpersonal community, national, international, and designed a training program that's reached 1,100 people in 45 countries. So one of the things we're particularly interested in, I wanted to know if you're incorporating this or would be interested, is providing the personal peace skills based on neuroscience, secular aspects of spirituality like mindfulness, heart math, technology, Stanford University, compassion research, forgiveness. So starting with that as a foundation, so that there's a different type of activism instead of the angry activist, someone who's embodying peace, and then the communication skills, and so that they're actually, and also they have the resilience, so they're not going to burn out right away. So I want to know if you're incorporating that, and or if you'd be interested in learning more about what we're doing to see if there's potential there.
Well, we'd definitely be interested. So, I mean, at the moment, we have the tool that Rotary Rudy mentioned, the Rotary Peace Academy, which is for Rotarians to work through, and it focuses mostly on IEP's framework and positive peace. But we are looking at future iterations of that academy and thinking about incorporating other tools that Rotarians or anyone can access related to peace building. So yes, I'd love to get your information. But additionally, I know the Rotarian Action Group for Peace has a lot of resources on their website, and I'm not sure if your information is on there, but you should definitely talk to Reem about that. I do think there's definitely interest in that, and at least the position that I'm in is to try to be able to incorporate different tools and activities to at least provide a whole host of options to Rotarians. So yes, I'd love to get your information.
Great, thanks, Summer.
Thank you.
Well, we are done with the panel. And just to close us, I want to start with something that, or kind of highlight something that Rudy raised, which is the story that, the Rotary started with one person. And here we are, we have 1.2 million Rotarians now. You've got millions and millions of other activists around the world and organizations, and in this room, we probably all know through our networks thousands and thousands and thousands of either practitioners or activists who consider themselves peace builders, right? And our calling at this sort of really turbulent time is to figure out how do we better harness for collective impact? And definitely, we wouldn't have been here, I think, without IEP and this visionary research, because, Provash, my colleague earlier today, talked about how do we in the peace movement do what the climate change movement did? Well, the climate change movement had science. Their scientists said the planet cannot absorb a 2 degrees Celsius increase, and that catalyzed, the foundation of advocacy. And I think IEP's, index has really given us the next generation of what can become the peace movement. So thank you to the movement builders, and thanks for the panel.